Joining us now is personal injury lawyer Alison Burson of Burson Law, and today we are talking about cannabis and impaired driving. Welcome back to What She Said, Alison.
Thanks for having me.
Now that it's legal, you want young drivers to know the law and the consequences of driving with THC in their system. So let's start talking about Bill C-46, which legalized recreational use in Canada.
It did. So October 17th was the day that we all saw in the media that cannabis became legal for people to use it for recreational purposes, to purchase it for recreational purposes and possess that.
Right.
But ultimately, Ontario also passed an act called the Cannabis Act 2017 and really tried to restrict a little bit more its use so that it would keep youth safe, whether it be where they are smoking it or potentially when they get behind the wheel of a vehicle. And so they made their own laws in addition to Bill C-46 regarding cannabis. Okay,
so what I found surprisingly was, I think it was a research out of Stats Canada, but I'm sure someone will tell me if I'm wrong about where it came from. But, when we look at young people driving under 25, they've been incredibly good about not driving with alcohol in their system. But 45% said that they had, of that age group, said that they had driven within an hour of smoking or vaping cannabis. So do we think that the numbers of people who actually are already driving in that sense are going to increase?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily the number of drivers are going to increase, but I think that there's going to be a crackdown, so to speak, on identifying those drivers. And I actually have the stat higher of people that have driven. Yeah. And actually, car crashes are the leading cause of death for youth aged 16 to 25. And in those particular car crashes, drugs or alcohol are a factor in 55% of those crashes. So,
and can we break down the 55% into what's alcohol and what's drugs, or do we know?
Not yet, because that's a stat, generally speaking, that we know there were some signs of impairment. And now with the new Cannabis Act and Bill C-46, legislatures have been struggling to figure out how do we test for cannabis in the system and what do we use as a test. And there's a lot of controversy around that. It actually, what should we be using, and is it a true test of impairment versus just having THC levels in their blood?
Well, and that's a key question, because there are medical cannabis users.
Yes.
And you would register as having it in your system pretty much 24 hours a day if you were a medical user.
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. I mean, there's some people that need medical marijuana on a daily basis, whether it's for anxiety or chronic pain. They use it in low amounts, though, in the sense that they won't show any signs of impairment, and they've been driving vehicles very safely. And now the new laws that came about in terms of what are the allowable levels of THC in your system could completely prevent those people from driving vehicles. And they're very, very concerned about that.
So what are the levels?
Okay, so just to kind of go over it, if you're over the age of 21 and you're not a new driver and you don't drive commercial vehicle,
that's us.
You are allowed an allowable amount of THC blood concentration of 2 nanograms per milliliter of blood.
But I don't understand what that translates into. Like, do you?
No.
Okay.
What is that? And if I do consume marijuana or cannabis, will that be out of my system or below the 2 nanograms? The other side of it, which is a real concern for youth, is anyone under the age of 21, a new driver, so that's G1, G2, M1, M2, or someone that drives commercial vehicles, it's zero tolerance. So they are not allowed to have any trace of THC in their blood if at any point they're pulled over and they're tested.
Okay, so if that zero tolerance is then violated by a young novice or commercial driver, what are the fines? What happens?
It can be upward financial fine of $500. It could be a license suspension of 3 days to upwards of 30 days, depending if there is more than one offense of this violation. They could be required to undergo education, medical evaluations. It could be even one of the situations where they are required to, blow into an interlock ignition device before they can actually drive the vehicle. And God forbid, if there's a serious injury or death, it's criminal code penalty of upward of 14 years in prison.
I think it's also interesting to note that the police tested, I think it's the Draeger test, the machine doesn't work in low temperatures. They're expensive. They're not carrying them all. So then you may have to go to a saliva test or a sobriety test, like, saying the alphabet backwards, which I've never been able to do in my most lucid moments, let alone under the stress of being, at your regular stop check. But I wanted to understand what they have to have a reasonable suspicion that you're impaired. Right. So what constitutes a reasonable suspicion? Is it that you're
driving too slow?
Driving too slowly.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the real subjective
So that would be
stage.
every little old lady. I mean, I'm telling you.
Potentially, or a nervous new driver.
Right.
And so that's a real, you've hit the nail on the head. It's a real subjective test that then suddenly allows these further tests that we know have failed in cold weather, or that we know that potentially THC levels in blood don't correspond with impairment levels when driving a vehicle. And now suddenly you're in a situation where THC is ultimately the test that we're looking at of whether they're going to be imposed these fines or these penalties that are severe. And we know that THC clears everyone else's or everyone's body differently, depending on just how their makeup is. And so there's been so much controversy that saying when we're dealing with alcohol, we actually know the test corresponds with impairment level when we're driving, not in the case of THC. And for some people, it could take days for THC to get below the legal allowable limit to drive.
Well, I mean, if you I don't know, I guess a comparison that I'm thinking of in my mind is if you take that athlete that had a poppy seed bagel and tested positive for opioids from the poppy seeds.
Yep.
So, things can be completely incorrect, and they can be career ending.
Absolutely.
In this day and age. So it's interesting. You have some information about how parents can talk to their children. Where can they access all that?
So the Ontario government has a very good website that talks about, what are the allowable THC levels that we've just gone over. They also have a link that says what are the consequences. We aren't sure how we know when THC will exit our body, but I think the first step for parents to do is to go to those websites and understand the laws in Ontario. They're different from province to province, and they're different than what's in the media. There's a lot of incorrect information coming out of the media, and particularly even people talking about it. So go to those websites, understand it first, so that you can then talk to your children about it and your youth about it, and make sure they understand it in terms of how it relates to them when they're driving.
Well, I was going to mention, in addition to what you had said earlier, I remember my children fighting over who would be the DD going out on a weekend. I have twins, right? Yeah. I mean, it was just unthinkable. You were not going to drink and get behind the wheel of a car. They were brought up. But given that we knew that in 48 hours they weren't going to have a level. So this is going to be really tough.
It is really different
to talk
for
to them and say, well, they'll say, yeah, well, I haven't smoked since Thursday.
Right. And I think that's the difference we're talking about. It is different than alcohol, and it will leave your system different from alcohol. So youth generally, I know what my limits are. I know when I'm okay to drive. And alcohol is one of those situations that within 12 hours, you can get behind the vehicle, or even within 6 if you've only had a beer or two, depending on what you're used to. You don't know with cannabis.
So how can people connect with you, Alison?
Okay, so I'm at Burson Law. You can connect with me on the web. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well.
Thank you very much for coming in and telling us about that.
Thank you.